Hey everybody, my name is Todd Miller, and today I'm going to be talking with you about body composition and the differences between body weight, body composition, and how we can use Neolife products to improve body composition along with diet and exercise. So, when we talk about body composition, what we are referring to are the components that make up the total body mass. So, on this slide here, we have an image, a little cartoon graphic of two people, two guys who are the same height and the same weight. And you can see that these guys are 180 centimeters and roughly 100 kilos. So, if we look at their BMI, which is essentially their height divided, or I'm sorry, their weight divided by their height in meters squared. And you can see that the BMI is the same for both of these individuals. Both of these individuals, because their height and weight are the same, have a BMI of almost 31, and both of them are classified as obese. But clearly, the guy on the left is not obese, right? The main difference between these two individuals is the guy on the right has much more fat and much less muscle than the guy on the left. So even though they weigh the same, the components that make up that weight are different. You can see that the guy on the left has a body fat of only 5%, while the guy on the right has a body fat of only 30%. So the guy on the right has a significantly more amount of fat than the guy on the left, yet their weight is the same. So this is why it's much more important and much more meaningful to monitor body composition than it is body weight. One of the most important reasons for this is you can see that the more muscle you have, the greater your basal metabolic rate is going to be. So you can see that the bodybuilder has a basal metabolic rate of 2,400 calories, meaning in a day, in a 24-hour period, if that guy does nothing except just sit in a seat, he's going to burn about 2,400 calories, whereas his neighbor over here is only going to burn about 1,800 calories. So that's about 550 calories less at the same body weight. And this is because this guy doesn't have as much muscle. So, muscle is the metabolic engine that burns calories, and that's the thing that we want to maintain. Now, you've often heard that fat weighs less than muscle. That is not true. The differences between fat and muscle lie in their densities. So, fat is less dense, it's about zero point 0.9 kilos per liter of volume, whereas muscle is about 1.06 kilos per liter of volume. So, if we look at this image here, you can see that we have two scales, and each scale is holding roughly 2 kilos of either fat or muscle. And you can see that even though these things weigh the same on the scale, you can see that muscle is much smaller. 2 kilos of muscle takes up much less space than 2 kilos of fat. Okay. So, this is why weight may not be the best thing to look at when we're doing some type of intervention to improve our body composition, because we might gain 2 kilos of muscle and lose 2 kilos of fat, and our weight wouldn't have changed at all. But you can see that you would be significantly smaller if you lost that 5 pounds of fat that's there on the right. And if we were to look at what this looks like in a more practical sense, people often will say, well, I only lost 2 kilos, so it really wasn't an effective program. Well, this is 2.3 kilos of fat. So you can see that if you had a 2 kilo weight loss and all of it came from fat, then that would be a pretty significant change. You should be able to see that, right? But if we have a 5 pound loss from muscle or a 5 pound loss from water, then you would not see these changes, right? You might see the change on the scale, but you really wouldn't look any different. Okay. And I think what most of us are trying to achieve is to look different aesthetically. That's really what's important. That's far more important than just having the number on the scale drop. Okay. Now, I want to discuss what happens when somebody goes on a starvation diet or when you go on some extreme diet where you're really restricting your calories. Now, what I have here, I'm going to put up a graph that's been adapted from a study called the Minnesota Starvation Study. And what they did in this study was they took a bunch of military recruits and they put them on a semi-starvation diet for 6 months. And when I say semi-starvation, that I basically mean they fed them 50% of the amount of calories that they require to maintain their weight. So they calculated what the calories were needed to maintain their weight and then cut that by 50%. And then they fed them that for 6 months. And then at the end of 6 months, they said, okay, you can eat normally. Now let's see what happens over that period. Now, on the left here, we have baseline values. And on the right, or I'm sorry, on the x-axis, you can see the semi-starvation period and then the refeeding period of 20 weeks. And we're going to be plotting fat mass, calorie intake, and muscle mass on this graph. So if we look at caloric intake first, we can see what happens. At baseline, at time one, as I said, they decreased the caloric intake by 50%. So you can see that their calories drop significantly at the start of the study. And they hold them there at that decreased caloric intake for 6 months, okay, semi-starvation. And then they feed the individuals. They say at the end of 6 months, they say, okay, eat whatever you want. And you can see that there is a significant increase in caloric intake. In fact, the caloric intake gets much, much higher than it was at baseline. During that refeeding period, they're eating as much as 180% what they were at baseline. So almost twice what they're eating at baseline. Okay. Now, what happens to fat mass during that same period? You can see that during the starvation portion, you have a significant drop in fat. Okay. So fat drops down to maybe, I don't know, 25% of its baseline value, it looks like. And then when the individuals start eating again, as you would expect, fat starts to come up. Okay. Now you'll notice that there's a point here where fat mass returns to its baseline value. Okay. Now you'll also notice that at this point, right here at this point, where fat mass, when the fat mass gets back to its baseline value, you'll notice that the caloric intake is still roughly about 40% higher than the baseline value. Okay. Now, this drive to eat, a caloric intake that's greater than the metabolic need, that's called hyperphagia. Okay. So you have this hyperphagic response where you just want to eat and eat and eat, even though your metabolic rate might be back to its baseline level, or it might even be lower than its baseline level, but you're overeating anyway. Okay, that's hyperphagia. So you'll notice that by the time the caloric intake gets back down to its baseline level, fat has increased significantly. So your body fat now might be, you might have 50% more fat, 30% more fat, something like that, because you've been overeating once the fat has returned back to its baseline value. Now, if we were to look at muscle, this green line, you can see sort of the same thing. During the first 6 months, you see a decrease in muscle mass. And then during the refeeding period, muscle mass comes back up. Now, what you'll notice is that when muscle mass returns to its baseline value, that's when the caloric intake falls to its baseline value. Okay. Now, what this means potentially is that if the fall in muscle mass is what's driving the overeating, then we should be able to prevent the overeating if we can prevent the fall in muscle mass. Okay, and that seems to make sense, right? If muscle mass returning back to its baseline value is what brings down caloric intake to baseline value, then we should never have the caloric intake overshoot if we don't lose the muscle mass in the first place. Okay, so the take-home message here is we need to maintain our muscle mass during weight loss if we want to prevent this fat overshoot, okay, and this hyperphagic response, okay? Now, generally, The general conventional wisdom regarding dieting and weight loss research is that during any type of weight loss intervention, you can expect about 20 to 30% of the weight loss to come from muscle. Okay. That's generally accepted and that's considered normal. The question is, does that have to happen? Right? Because we just showed in the previous slide, one thing we want to avoid is muscle loss. And this slide is showing that with most dieting programs, you're going to lose a bunch of muscle. So if we look at this image here, this is showing the percent of fat and muscle that's lost during various dieting programs. So on the bottom here, you can see we have a very low calorie diet. So this is just caloric restriction, just like we had in the previous slide, extreme caloric restriction. Then we have a low carb diet, a low fat diet, a high protein diet, and a high fiber. The blue bars represent how much of the weight loss as expressed as a percentage comes from fat. And the gray bars represent how much of a weight loss in percentage comes from muscle. And you can see with 4 out of 5 of these dieting plans, you have about 75% of the weight loss coming from fat and about 25% of the weight loss coming from muscle. Now, if we look, and again, all of these are in a caloric restriction. So all of these diets, the individual is burning more calories than they're eating. Okay. If we look at the high protein diet, for the high protein diet, these individuals have nearly 90% of their weight loss from fat, and only about 10% of their weight loss comes from muscle. Okay. So what we're showing here is that when you calorie restrict, but also increase the protein intake, you will lose less muscle as a result of that intervention. Now, another thing I should add is that it is possible to completely prevent all muscle losses during dieting. And we do that through a combination of a high protein diet coupled with a weight training program. Okay? So weight training combined with high protein will allow you to maintain your muscle and in some cases even gain muscle while you're losing fat. Okay. And this is critically important because one of the strongest predictors of whether or not you're going to regain your weight after your weight loss is how much muscle you lose. So if we were to look at this graph here and look at these various diets, the people who are on these other diets that have 25% of their loss coming from muscle, those people are much more likely to regain the weight than the individuals who are on the high protein diet. Okay. And if those individuals on the high protein diet also added weight training, and if they could get to a point where they lost no muscle during that intervention, then they are even going to be less likely to have weight regain. Okay. So again, maintaining that muscle is critically important. So let's look at the protein and calorie content in different foods, just to get an idea of what we're looking at. Now, generally, you'll often hear people say, well, peanut butter is a good source of protein. Let's look and see if that's actually true. So here we have, now I've normalized all these foods to about 18 or 19 grams of protein. Okay. So if you were to try and get 18 grams of protein from peanut butter, you would have to eat 423 calories worth of peanut butter. Okay. Now let's contrast that with egg whites. If you wanted to get 19 grams of egg white protein from egg whites, you'd only have to eat 86 calories. Okay. So when we are considering foods that are high protein, low calorie, the best way to sort of figure that out is by looking at the calorie to protein ratio. So if we look at peanut butter, if we were to divide the number of calories by the grams of protein, you can see that we get 24. That means for each gram of protein in that peanut butter, we have to eat 23 calories. If we go down to the egg whites, we can see that for each gram of protein in the egg whites, we only have to eat 5 calories. Okay. So the calorie to protein ratio is much better for egg whites than it is for peanut butter. Okay. So this is a very easy way to try and make a decision on the fly as to whether a food is a good source of protein. because lots of foods have protein. And this ribeye steak has a lot of protein in it, right? But it's got a pretty high calorie to protein ratio because it's got a high amount of fat. So again, if we're trying to stay in a caloric deficit, but also increase our protein intake, we need to eat lean proteins, not just food that has a lot of protein. Okay. So, what is the challenge here? The challenge is how do you increase your protein intake while ensuring you remain in a calorie deficit? Well, like I said, you need to eat lean foods that are high in protein. And what are some of those? Well, the Neo Life Shake is probably the best example that I can think of right now. And um, these things have a lot of benefits, and there's a lot of reasons why Neo Life Shakes are a really smart thing to incorporate into your dietary plan. So, and we'll talk about those more here in a second. But if we look at the calorie to protein ratio for Neo Life Shakes, you can see where they shake out here, right? No pun intended. But um, the Neo Life Shake mixed in non-fat milk is going to give you 26 grams of protein and 237 calories, which is a calorie to protein ratio of 9. And if you mix the shake in water, you're going to get a calorie to protein ratio of 8. So you can see that if whole eggs are 12 and egg whites are 5, you might say to yourself, well, I'm just going to make a general rule that I'm only going to eat protein foods that have a calorie to protein ratio of 10 or less. Okay. So that means your Neo Life Shakes fall under that. And maybe an egg whites obviously would fall under that. Skinless chicken breast would fall under that. But then once you get to whole eggs, you're at a calorie protein ratio of 12, and that would be over your arbitrary mark of 10 calories per gram. So um, again, this is just an easy way to sort of determine what we would call a good source of protein. Now, if we look again at our Neo Life Shakes, we could see that there's some things in here that make these things really good options for uh, trying to maintain protein intake and muscle mass while you're dieting. The first is it's a proprietary blend of protein, and blended proteins are really important. We're going to talk about why in a second. They're biologically complete proteins, and complete proteins mean that they contain all of the amino acids that are necessary to optimize muscle growth and things of that nature. And um, some foods have a complete amino acid profile where they have all the amino acids that you need, and then other foods are not complete. Generally, animal sources of protein tend to have a higher biological quality than plant sources. But Neolife shakes are biologically complete with all the amino acids. As I said, there's 18 grams per serving if you mix them with water. And they also contain branched chain amino acids. And branched chain amino acids are important because they can be metabolized, burned directly in muscle for fuel. So, one of the advantages of this is that during long, exhaustive type exercise, you're less likely to break down your own muscle and consume that muscle for fuel, those amino acids for fuel, if you're providing these branched chain amino. It also has 5 grams of fiber, which is really satisfying and fills you up. Um, Protein is also a very satisfying macronutrient. So when you have protein and fiber together in the same beverage, then that is very satisfying and will keep you full for a long time. Now let's get back to blended proteins. On the left, we have the Neolife shake label. And you can see here that the protein sources are soy protein, there's milk protein, there's milk powder, which is another form of milk protein. So we have both animal-based proteins and plant-based proteins in the shake. Now, why is this important? Proteins are made up of amino acids. And when you eat a protein, it breaks down and those amino acids go out into the bloodstream. They're carried to various tissues. Those amino acids are taken into those tissues and they're used to build new tissues, synthesize new proteins, help with exercise recovery, that sort of thing. And ideally, we want to have amino acid levels in the blood high all the time. That way we have amino acids available to us for muscle recovery whenever the muscle needs it. Now, if we look at this graph on the right, on the y-axis, you'll see something that says bioavailability. And this is just how many amino acids are available to the muscle for recovery and things like that. On the x, you have the absorption rate. And this is essentially how long does it take after you eat the protein, how long does it take for those amino acids to spike in the blood? Okay. And you can see that that varies based on protein source. So whey isolate would be the fastest. So if I were to drink a shake that is just pure whey isolate and whey is a milk protein. Isolate means it has all the fat and carbs and lactose removed from it. It's just pure protein. So whey isolate, you can see within an hour, you have a peak in amino acids. The amino acids spike within an hour and then they start to fall. So by the time you get to the 2-hour point, your whey isolate, by 2 hours, these proteins are back down to baseline, essentially. Whey concentrate, which is whey protein that doesn't have all the carbs, fat, and lactose removed. Whey concentrate absorbs a little slower. Plant proteins absorb slower than that. So if you're eating a soy drink, for example, you might not see a peak in amino acid profile till 3 or 4 hours after you drink the shake, okay? Which would be less than ideal because you wouldn't have those elevated amino acids immediately following ingestion of the shake. And then finally, the last thing you see here is casein. Casein is also a milk protein, and it is the slowest absorbing. So this, you'll see that even out at 6 hours, you'll see casein peaking at about the 6-hour mark. So with a blend of proteins, you get a rapid spike in amino acids in the blood as soon as you drink it. You go a few hours out, you have that new protein sort of kicking in, and now the plant protein kicking in, and now those amino acids are higher. And then when the plant protein starts to fade away, the casein comes in and you have a more elevated amino acid profile. And you can see that this will stay elevated for 6 or 7 hours if you have this blend. So this is why we have a blend of proteins in the Neo Life Shake. And it's very effective at keeping amino acids elevated for a long period of time. Now, not all proteins are the same. One of the things that people have that's become very popular lately is collagen protein. And on the right is a label from collagen protein. And you can see that there are 11 grams of protein in this supplement, but also notice that it says this is not a significant source of protein, okay? The protein that is in collagen are essentially, it's just a few amino acids. It's definitely not a complete amino acid profile. Half of the amino acids in collagen are proline and hydroxyproline, which are non-essential. You don't even really need to get them through the diet, and they're not involved in muscle repair or anything like that. They're really just involved in the maintenance of connective tissue, cartilage, tendon, ligament, things like that. So this protein, you may have 11 grams of protein in this collagen, but the daily value, 0, right? So it's not, you shouldn't count this as part of your protein intake if you are using a collagen supplement. So let's say you're going to say to yourself, I want to eat 150 grams of protein today. If you drink 2 of these servings of this collagen protein, and that gives you 20 some grams of protein, you're not going to count that towards those 150 grams. Okay. So, and over here on the left, we have the Neo Life Shake, and you could say you could see this is calculated for 100 grams. So 100 gram of the shake is going to give you 42 grams of protein. And again, these are complete proteins, biologically complete proteins. If you mix that with milk, then you're getting an even greater protein profile, because now you have the milk in addition to the shake. So the Neolife shake has an ideal protein to carb to fat ratio, that helps keeping you full and satisfied. It only has 150 calories when you mix it in water, and it's got a wide spectrum of vitamins and minerals. So it really is an excellent sort of meal replacement option. And you can use these things as meals, as snacks, whenever you feel like you want to drink a shake, have it, right? Because it's only going to be good for you. You're not going to be able to drink too many of them. Okay. Now, I want to talk a little bit about the effectiveness of these shakes for weight loss. And this is a study that was done using the Neolife shake. And essentially, what they did was they took overweight and obese subjects and they enrolled them in a 12-week study and asked them to replace 2 of their meals with a Neolife shake and don't change anything else. So they didn't change their exercise program. They made no other dietary modifications except replacing 2 meals with a Neolife shake. And at the end of the study, the subjects lost on average about 2.5 kilograms, roughly 5 pounds. The BMI decreased from 29.7 to 29.2. Hip circumference decreased, so they got smaller from 109 to 107 centimeters. And then there were also some improvements in blood lipid profile and things like that. So, what we're showing here is that this is something that's very easy to do, right? If you can replace one meal with a Neolife shake, um, you will see you are most likely going to see some type of fat loss and some type of muscle gain. If you use 2 shakes, and there's sort of a dose response here. So one shake will give you a result. Replacing 2 meals with 2 shakes will give you a much better result. Okay. Um, so, uh, and it's like, I don't know if this is the case, but it is likely true that if you also use these shakes for snacks, you'll even get even greater weight loss. Okay. And part of the reason for this is when you replace a meal with a Neolife shake, because it has a high protein and high fiber content, it's very satisfying. So just by drinking 2 shakes per day, you end up being fuller longer and you end up eating less throughout the day, even though you're not trying. So this is why this is something that's critically important to remember, is that you don't have to do any other type of dietary intervention. Odds are, if you were to replace 2 meals with these shakes, odds are you will end up in a calorie deficit. You will end up increasing your protein intake. And as a result of that, you are likely, or you should see, um, some improvement in body composition, whether that comes from an increase in muscle mass or a decrease in fat, whatever it is. You should be able to experience that from using Neolife shakes in this manner. Now, there are some supporting products I want to talk about very briefly. Botanical Balance helps to support healthy glucose levels. When you are in a calorie restricted state, oftentimes carbohydrate intake is sort of all over the place, and that leads to fluctuating glucose levels. Um, and this sort of levels that out, um, and keeps you sort of even in terms of your glucose and insulin responses. So the next thing we have is the Neolife bar. Neolife bar is another great protein option. It's got 10 grams of protein. It's got 5 grams of fiber. Again, protein and fiber fill you up. So Neolife bars as snacks coupled with Neolife shakes, replacing a meal or two, and you're going to have a really good dietary intervention where you're going to be eating less, but you're not going to have a problem with vitamin deficiencies or anything like that, because you are getting these complete nutritional sources through the bar and the shakes. Finally, we have Neolife tea, which provides energy and a lot of times when, I should say, helps you feel more energetic. Um, a lot of times when we diet and we are in a calorie restricted state, that can affect mental clarity and things of that nature. And the Neo Life tea is one of those things that might be able to help with that. Now, some people have some common questions usually about the shakes in general. And some of those questions are they good for people who are interested in sports and athletic performance? And the answer to that is definitely yes. People who are involved in athletics and sports have a higher, generally, have a higher protein requirement than somebody who is not. And this is a very portable, on the go way to get protein quickly. And it's an excellent option for anybody who is interested in increasing muscle mass and decreasing fat. And if you are interested in improving sport performance, there's probably nothing that has a greater effect on sport performance, virtually every sport performance. Nothing has a better effect than losing fat and gaining muscle. Okay. So it absolutely is a viable option for people interested in sports. How long does it take to lose weight? Well, as we said, one thing you need to remember, the faster the weight comes off, the more likely that weight loss is to be from muscle. And that is a bad scene. Okay. We don't want weight loss coming from muscle. So if you were to do some type of extreme calorie restriction, you can lose weight pretty quick. But where's the weight coming from? Extreme calorie restriction or total elimination of carbohydrate or things like that, that's going to result in rapid weight loss. But most of that weight loss is going to come from muscle. Okay. So, as a general rule, the faster you lose it, the more likely it is to be from muscle. The other thing to remember is that one of the things we're trying to do is prevent muscle loss. And in some cases, if you're somebody who's sedentary, who doesn't work out, and you decide you're going to start lifting weights and drinking Neo-Life shakes, you're likely going to gain muscle. And you can gain muscle at a faster rate than you lose fat. So, what if you gain 5 pounds of muscle and lose 4 pounds of fat, right? You're going to be leaner, but if you got on the scale, you'd be a pound heavier. So, how long does it take to lose weight is not really the question we should be asking, right? The question we should be asking is how long does it take to improve body composition? And that is generally can be a slower process, but the outcome is more permanent, right? So when you have actual changes in muscle tissue, meaning your muscle tissue is going up and your fat tissue is going down, those changes are much more likely to stick around than if your weight loss is just because you've lost a bunch of water out of your muscles. Okay, that's going to come back very, very quickly. Okay. So there's a lot of factors that go in, that come into play when we're simply looking at how long does it take to lose weight. Should the shake be used before or after physical activity? There are advantages to using the shake either before or after physical activity. So generally what we're trying to do, everybody used to say back in the day that as soon as you're done exercising, you should drink a protein drink. Well, that's not really that important. What's important is that you're consuming protein sometime within a couple hours of the workout, either before or after. So the Neo Life Shake is a great option to use before or after physical activity. And I would say, as long as you're drinking that within maybe 1 to 2 hours, either before or after, then that is perfectly adequate for allowing those amino acids to be high in the blood for a significant period of time. So it's not so critical as to whether you're doing it before or after, as long as it's somewhere near the workout. And finally, is the Neo Life Shake a good breakfast option? I think we've addressed this a little bit. Yes, it's a very good breakfast option. And it's because, again, protein and fiber are very satisfying. And when you drink a Neo Life Shake or a meal replacement shake for breakfast, you just tend to eat less throughout the rest of the day. And this has been shown in several studies looking at various other brands of meal replacement shakes. But in general, having a shake for breakfast, again, because of the high protein and fiber content, it's satisfying. It keeps you full. So it doesn't mean that you're not going to be hungry at lunchtime, but you're going to be less hungry at lunch than if you didn't drink the shake. Even drinking the shake as a snack between breakfast and lunch is a great idea, or as a snack between lunch and dinner is a great idea. Again, because one of the worst things that you can do is skip breakfast. And people do this all the time. They skip breakfast, skip lunch, and they say to themselves, well, I do good during the day. And what they're saying is when they do good, it means they don't eat. Well, that's not doing good, because then by the time you get home for dinner, you're starving and then you eat everything in sight. So using the Neolife shakes for breakfast are an excellent option to help keep you satisfied throughout. Well, that's all I have. Thanks very much for checking in and for listening. And I hope you found something valuable in this presentation. And I wish you all the best of luck in the new year. Thanks.